Spencer, off you go.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to start with a testimony from a student, Gina Parody, which Spencer will read.
And I've just realized we're missing the man of the hour.
He'll be back, he said. I told him to carry
I'm
out.
too quick for my own good.
That's great. It's just like, yeah, that was too far.
So we need some delicate elevator.
Yeah.
You said it
What do you got?
he was here.
You could put on that. You could put on that.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Let's make sure. Let me just go and fish him out of whatever snag he's fallen into. Oh, does he? Where's Anna? Oh yeah. Okay. Where's Anwar? Oh, there you go. Now we are lost. Now we're truly lost.
Sometimes I know, sometimes I know.
That is not your reputation.
People talking about Turkish.
I don't, unfortunately. I should have. I was trying to entertain a 6-year-old and 4-year-old. He did 1 minute. 1 minute. 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. Is that a countdown?
Did he come?
Oh, right. I could know.
Actually, the one thing I can usefully tell you all who are in the room is that Silvina has very kindly refreshed the coffee and the pastries or whatever is left, and there are a few goodies that came back with us at lunchtime, so you can certainly help yourselves to any of those, either now or between this and the conversation. Otherwise, I'm struggling. Cap and cane routine. Would that be, or you could work on your stand-up. Yeah, I don't have any. That's what we've already established. Yeah. So these two economists walk into a bar. This would be improv, though. Oh, here we go! By the way, just as we're getting settled as well, I'll mention to everybody who might have noticed that our colleague Nikos very kindly agreed to just be added to the conversation panel, just in case Jami Madood, who is joining us post-haste, we hope, is held up in New York traffic. So we won't, hopefully,
That panel now, or?
no, we get to just sit and relax and listen to the students. So Spencer and Danielle, over to you.
All right, so we're going to start with a testimonial from, as Danielle mentioned, Gina Parody. And this testimonial to Anwar is titled, "An Economist Grounded on the Humanity of This Planet." Anwar taught me a new way of looking not only at the economic system, but at the world itself. For that, I am infinitely grateful. Economic discussions in my country, Colombia, and in Latin America in general, have been led by neoclassical economists. For them, austerity represented by the fiscal rule is a panacea. Non-intervention in the market is a dogma. Lowering the minimum wage is the best solution for generating employment, and economic growth without considering distribution is the most important aspect of the system. For years, none of this made sense to me, but I didn't have the tools to be part of these debates and to refute these ideas. That is, until I arrived at the new school and met Anwar Shaikh. He was the first professor I had contact with, and he welcomed me into his class on crises and austerity. With his charisma and intelligence, he led me down a fascinating path of knowledge that allowed me to understand the world in a new way. Examining the 2008 crisis through a lens other than the neoclassical one was the first step in changing my approach to understanding the world. The mortgages that were seen as the root cause of everything were actually just a consequence of a series of actions that triggered the crisis. First, the weakening of the labor class that produced a rise in surplus value, in which real wages continued to grow, but less than productivity. Second, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates near to 0%. And third, a tremendous deregulation of the market. As Anwar says, the crisis happened, quote, on schedule, because crises are a part of the capitalist system, not because of a market failure. His theory of real competition is an understanding of the world as it is, as we live it. It is the world of human beings, where competition is not perfect but real, with its antagonistic nature and turbulent operation, in which the desire for profits is unlimited and people are willing to do anything, even resort to violence, to obtain them. This allowed me to understand why violence in my country, Colombia, is persistent, because violence in the capitalist system is profit-led. Understanding that free trade does not make countries competitive, nor does it generate the full employment or the catch-up promised by the neoclassicals, allowed me to analyze the mistakes that Latin America has fallen into. In short, Anwar's teachings, which are the product of his academic rigor and dedication to his students, have left an immense and indelible mark on me, and of course, on my way of trying to contribute to building a better world. I miss my frequent talks with Anwar because they were minutes of infinite learning. I will miss them for the rest of my life. Thank you, Anwar, for teaching me so much.
Now we'll have our first student speaker, Qasim Abbas.
Thank you. Hello. I also wrote my comments. I figured that if I'm allotted 15 minutes of time, I want to get all the points in. I'm also Pakistani, by the way. Where's the other person? Aside from
There's so many of us here.
non-countable set of Pakistanis. So I wanted to get all the points in, and I will be quick. I do read my own writing quickly. So there we go. I'd like to thank the organizers of today's event in celebration of my dissertation supervisor, Anwar Shaikh, and mentor. I, like others on the panel today, the students, had the unique honor of having our dissertation work advised by the scholar, exceptional scholar, sharp mind. Each of us on the panel has their own particular reasons for why we came to the new school studying under Anwar Shaikh. Mine began with coming across a phrase in his writings: "The object of investigation is the real." The object of investigation is the real. As a fervent student of the automotive industry, to me, such a phrase means the material conditions facing workers and communities are at the forefront of Shaikh's analysis of capitalism. The specific aspects of real competition framework that drew me to his work is the explicit treatment of perpetual cost-cutting behavior on the part of firms. This is no surprise from the standpoint of business literature, but it's awfully difficult to trace using neoclassical tools of analysis where, as a point of departure, perfectly competitive firms profit maximize at a point where they cost minimize. Cost minimization is not the same as cost cutting. Even adjusting for the reality where perfect access to information, factor mobility, infinitesimally small firms do not exist, tools of analysis that are employed by neoclassical theory continue to prove highly intractable, in my opinion, in theorizing key aspects of firm behavior. A lot of us in this room have come to appreciate through Anwar's work that theories of imperfection are nothing but a dual of perfection. But even if one is to attempt to use neoclassical tools developed to study market organization of modern firm, I find that what the historical record shows remain highly onerous to be captured. Take, say, the chapter in Maskell of Winston Green, theorizing market power of firms. I believe it's chapter 12. Market power firms in industries occupied by a small number of large-scale firms. No dearth of industrial organization literature today can be found arguing that the auto and steel industries exhibit key features of monopolistic competition. These features of monopoly and oligopoly appear in what has now been accepted as the gold standard graduate micro textbook in PhD programs of economics PhD programs all over the world, and also seeping into other programs like public policy. Despite the mathematically elegant tools of analysis that seemingly offer explanations for a massive breadth of economic phenomena, economic historical accounts of actual firm behavior that are most relevant to the lives of workers' communities remain quite difficult to be founded in such tools, I think. For instance, one of the only times that the cost per unit is explicitly discussed in their treatment of market power, Maskell, Winston Green mention it in the context of the Cornell model of quantity competition. Unit cost is set to reflect total output, which is produced below socially optimal levels so as to exercise undue power. Economic history, on the other hand, shows that the automakers, in particular, of any scale, perpetually cut costs, often out of an imperative to simply survive, not exercise market power. This is why they constantly change location, abandoning workers in one part of the world in order to produce cheaply elsewhere. Real competition very clearly connects cost cutting and price undercutting with the profit motive, such that the tools of analysis clearly comport with what economic history tells us. In the case of the auto industry, deindustrialization in one part of the world comes in tandem with reindustrialization of another. As rising wages resulting from labor's organizing efforts benefit workers in the US, capital abandons them and moves to Mexico and other parts of the global south to tap into the reserve army of labor for lower unit labor costs. Moreover, where product differentiation in mainstream economics is considered a source of imperfection in that it's a deviation from homogeneity in output, real competition claims and economic history confirms that it is precisely the ability to introduce product changes that allows competition over quality to take place. The ability to differentiate products, along with price undercutting, advertising, are all tools in the arsenal of the competitor to fight over market share. Similarly, as capital is assumed to be held fixed in the short run according to mainstream micro, real competition makes no broad, general sweeping assumptions on the fixity of capital over any horizon, short or long. This is fully in line with historical evidence that I have documented in my dissertation work that shows that auto capitals, regardless of scale, immediately change location in response to the actions of rivals as well as in response to changing consumer demand. If so doing, makes production cheaper. Most importantly though, for me, such differences between the two frameworks are not the main reason why I began working with real competition. I think the framework is particularly important because it is scientific, which means it is internally consistent and externally valid given it's capable of confronting evidence. Constructs such as monopoly and oligopoly don't just dominate neoclassical industrial organization literature, they take primacy in the works of most left economists and Marxists. Shaikh teaches us that without a general theory of perfection, right, that is both comprehensive and complete, one cannot claim theoretical distinguishability from neoclassical views of perfection. Howard Botwinick, a former student of Anwar's, points out that imperfection is merely a negative mirror image of perfection itself. To my mind, as a researcher, if we on the left don't reach the highest bar for rigor in explaining phenomena, we yield the ground to neoclassical economics who will indeed provide explanations for the world and ground them in fantasy without apology. For those of us concerned with anti-capitalist strategy, I'm included, we must understand that theory informs praxis, and that good praxis cannot result from unsound analysis of the very structure and logic of capitalism. If we must do away with the idea that we are in a new stage of capitalism where industries composed of few large-scale firms have fundamentally altered the laws of accumulation themselves. The emergence of finance capital at the turn of the last century did not usher in a capitalism that's fundamentally different from what Marx was describing. Sheikh's work on value theory only confirms that the labor theory of value holds. Today, despite what might seem like cartelization or combination of business enterprise leading to some new stage in capitalism. His work in keeping alive the classical tradition confirms for us that the laws of motion undergirding capitalism have not changed, and that capitalism that Marx inspired us to overthrow has also not in its foundation changed. Having studied the auto industry, I don't find that we live under some different incarnation of capitalism that can be made more humane through antitrust legislation, let's say, or breakup of big banks, big business. Finally, I want to echo what Shaikh always taught me about technique and the usage of math as an economist. Math is no substitute for theory, and one must never become mystified by it, despite the power it affords the user. We as young heterodox economists must go out in the world making our mark as different from orthodoxy because we take theory seriously, not necessarily because our usage of math is superior to mainstream. Employment of better mathematical tools cannot simply become the primary means of challenging orthodoxy. We must take history of thought to the contestation of ideas themselves. On the other hand, being scientific does not mean imitating mainstream. Rather, it means doing the diligent work of explaining phenomena in a way that carries in a foundation that both reflects reality and meets standards of rigor. Such is the main inspiration I have taken from Shaikh, Botwinick, Sulfidis, Salifi, Mason, Tanakh, and others who have had the good fortune of working with Sheikh in the past. For this, I'd like to thank the organizers one more time, and thank you for inviting me.
I can always introduce myself, but it's better for you to introduce.
We now have Giannis, our very own in the department.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna start by saying a big thanks to everyone that organized this. It's a largely successful so far discussion, and it's a great honor to be here today celebrating the work of Anwar Shaikh, who is, besides our professor, one of our mentors, and one of the reasons that we came a long way to actually study here and be part of this tradition. I'm gonna actually leave some things out of my presentation and address the motivation, because I think also Kasim mentioned that we have perhaps different motivations why we came here. So I would like to share mine. So born and raised in Greece, especially under the Greek crisis, the European crisis, there's a discussion of the questions of European North and South, the uneven development of the Union, and also we have to acknowledge in this kind of celebration of the work that there are some people spread throughout the world that introduce us and are, I think, intellectual allies of the framework. And mine, and I have to acknowledge openly, was Professor Andriana Vlachou, who introduced me to the works of Anwar and actually gave me this opportunity to open up this framework and actually go into the framework. So my presentation will mostly be conceptual today. I won't have any graphs or any numbers, and I would like to invite everyone here, perhaps that's useful, to take a step back, a conceptual step back, and think over terms and concepts and frameworks. And mostly I will be focused on the question of development. And I'm taking the question, is there any room for development in the real economic analysis framework? And if so, in what way? And I'm going to suggest that there is a way that we can actually address questions of development by probably incorporating Anwar's framework into a larger synthesis that can be consistent and probably useful. Having said that, the structure of the presentation very briefly, I'm going to actually talk about the notions around development and how I see them in the work of Anwar. Then I'm going to talk about some of the insights of the classical political economy, which in my understanding, in my research, it's very early on, and I have to admit that there is something to be said if we return to the sources in a critical way, and how Anwar positions himself and the framework against mainstream theories and radical theories. And it's not a matter of opinion. Once I was in a classroom of Anwar, I asked Anwar, okay, what is your opinion over something? And then he said to me very bluntly, I don't care about my opinion, I care about my theory. So the theory is there, and I think the theory speaks very strongly about these issues. And last but not least, I would try to draw some lines in terms of how the work of Anwar can be a basis for inspiration, and a source of inspiration, a basis for reconstruction or extension. First of all, the questions of uneven development and development, in my understanding, have been contested by different approaches, ranging from all development economists to structuralists, to Keynesians, of course, monopoly capitalism is cool, and decolonial Marxism. But apparently, the use of these terms, it's unclear what they mean. I mean, probably, in my view so far, is that there appear to be different understandings of what is uneven development and what constitutes underdevelopment. I just want to put an emphasis on that I don't think that this is resolved in a sense in the literature. Now, let's think about the work of Anwar and the work of capitalism. We'll start with the kind of goal of capitalism. Well, what is the kind of stated goal of capitalism? Which it's, of course, to develop a theoretical structure appropriate to the actual operation of existing developed capitalist countries. So if one stop there, you would say, well, there's nothing to present about development, about the rest of the world. We only care about industrialized capitalist mature economies. But if you move forward, you actually see that development is part of the work. For example, Anwar mentions that development and development, characteristic unevenness across localities, regions, and nations are part of capitalism disorders. And at the end, I think this is an even more powerful quote, is that there is an inspiration of analyzing mature capitalism in order to understand the connections, but also the process of capitalist development. And the quote is that the analysis of capitalism in its most developed form is essential to an adequate understanding of the relations between developing and underdeveloped arenas of the world. So in a sense, if one sees the work of Anwar, ranging, I guess, from the 80s, from the papers on science society, up until the contemporary and culmination of his work, with, of course, capitalism, but also the globalization myth of free trade, one, I think, can trace the question of development there. Now, moving forward, if one returns to the classical, we're always asked to return to the sources, right? And the sources are the classical authors. We know, for example, that capitalist development unfolds globally the moment that they're writing, that of course with misconception and limitations, they follow these developments. And there's a literature that of course has addressed the classical authors as development economists or addressing questions of development. For example, Sen will talk about Smith, but Naik in a very famous article on Marx, and Daridi and Davis will actually talk about the whole classical political econometician tradition in terms of trade, growth, and uneven development. Now, more specifically, I'm going to talk about Marx and Engels. I cannot summarize the whole idea, but there is something to be said. I mean, I want to bring the attention to actually three main points. The first main point is that Marx and Engels address in their works, not in the same depth or in the same seriousness and analytical rigor, a diverse set of economists that have different pre-capitalist modes, are also in the under different pre-capitalist modes. There are different levels of capitalist development and also have particularities. One can think that Marx and Engels talk about economies such as India, China, Ireland, Russia, Germany, United States, and Britain. Britain is the closest to the abstraction of the capital, one could say. Now, the famous article from Patnaik argues that in Marx's work, and I will also add Engels' work, there is two processes that are developed. This is the process of development, analysis of development of capitalism, which is this process that relate how is capital made the dominant social relation in its early form, and the development under capitalism, which means this process of capital accumulation, competition, and profit. Now, if we return to the classical authors, I mean, I cannot go into depth into that. I think that there is some kind of raw materials for a theory of uneven development that is dynamic, especially, for example, how we enter competition, and historically specific. I will actually explain what I mean by that. And there are two aspects of uneven development. There's a locus of uneven development. There are the backward-looking aspects, so the ways that the development of capitalism impacts the development under capitalism, but there's also this endogenous to capitalism processes, the forward-looking aspects, that are also part of this discussion. And, in my understanding, underdevelopment is the expression of these two processes that collide in different ways, but the elements are always the same. It's a socioeconomic expression of this locus. Now, moving forward, this is a schematization of the framework. Just to repeat, we have the development of capitalism, which, in a sense, impact through this backward-looking aspect, how capitalism develops under the dominant relation. There are also this endogenous process to capitalism that we want to emphasize, that in a sense are the forward-looking aspects. And now, of course, in the work of Marx and Engels, there are, of course, vertical differentiations. That means that there are analyses of economies at different levels of development. Of course, the elements are the same, but the relative importance is different. And also, there are different ways of horizontal differentiation across economies that have different pre-capitalist modes, but also different particularities. I can't go more in depth into it, but there is a framework that I think can help us move forward. And it's still early on my research, that's also important. Now, the work of Anwar, I won't go into detail because it was already mentioned this morning. I think is a kind of critique, a strong theoretical but also empirical critique on the neoclassical approach on trade, development, and convergence. And instead, the framework of real capitalist competition leads us to what? Uneven development, persistence of trade imbalances, no convergence, as the neoclassicals would actually say. And a part of, I won't repeat the points, but part of the earlier work, and I have to say that in terms of how we can push the framework or rethink the importance of certain things, also included FDI, the Papers of Science Society, and its impact on the development process. That it can lead to modernization, but not necessarily, and it can also lead to a particular mode of modernization. I'm just bringing the attention that this thing existed in the framework, right? And we have to think of the importance. And there's, I think, a thread in the work that goes, it's contemporary and touches upon these issues in terms of the critique to the mainstream approach. Now, it was also argued, so I won't go into great detail, that there is a huge body of literature from the radical perspective that address the question of underdevelopment and even development, ranging from the monopoly capitalist movement, Baron Sweezy, up to all the new dependencies. Like, for example, Dudley Sears, Weissenbach, and now Ingrid, which is also an alumni of our school. And some of the basic aspects of the framework, as I see them, is as fundamental importance and emphasis on the backward-looking aspect. So how this early process of the development of capitalism condition, in a sense, the development under capitalism. They're very strong on that. In a sense, this kind of integration of world capitalist system, appropriation of surplus, of course, the idea of monopoly capitalism and the siphoning and unproductive use, plus the reproduction of a parasitic class structure. There's, of course, the framework of unequal exchange and this cumulative process of capital accumulation. In the work of, especially Dudley Sears, we see the question of political and cultural hegemonies, kind of strengthening or deepening peripheral dependency. And in the most contemporary form of this tradition or traditions, in a plural, is the structurally disadvantaged position in global value chains, the nature of, you're killing me but I will try to rush, the nature of transnational corporations, the technological dependencies, and of course the leaders on subordinate financialization. That's in a sense the contemporary takes. Now moving forward, I think there is a body of literature if one looks back that Anwar is part of, and probably not only part of, a point of reference which actually critiques these views, the radical theories of underdevelopment, which I see also late John Weeks participating in that, Baron, and there's a contribution of Leodakis, who is, I guess, in a similar vein. And I want to emphasize that all discussions are taking contemporary importance. There is a lot of work on dependency, a lot of work on Indian development, global north, global south, core periphery. So this discussion is ongoing. And one has to consider, as we move forward with this discussion and these frameworks are used, not only the methodological, but also the technical problems. I will skip over the methodological in the sake of time, but I will emphasize what I think Anwar is really kind of pinning down in this debates, which is the technical aspects of unequal exchange, its position as a mechanism of underdevelopment. It's a very strong critique, that it's not that straightforward as many authors would like to have it. And the second is the critique of monopoly view. And I want to bring that to your attention. In the beginning we discussed that there is this importance of the forward-looking aspects, this process endogenous to capitalism, that in the classical sense or in the sense of the real economic analysis framework, are dynamic, antagonistic, and turbulent. The way that the series approaches these processes is completely static. So in a way, even though the backward-looking aspects, there are also, a lot of, I think, weaknesses in terms of addressing the backward-looking aspect. Essentially, this kind of emphasis of production, of exchange over production, but there's also a complete negligence of the forward-looking aspects of uneven development, the process endogenous to capitalism. And I will end, how many minutes do I have? 3, 2, perfect. Okay, I'm gonna end with what I feel are steps forward. I think we really need to reconsider this conceptual unclarity that exists under these terms and kind of pin down what we mean by uneven development and underdevelopment. That's, in my understanding, a very important point. We have to construct an integrated theory that addresses both aspects, both the backward and the forward, and one has to think on the way of doing so, dynamic and historically specific. Okay. The third is that, as Anwar would say, and I hear his voice in my head, strong empirical evidence. We need that for sure in this theory, in this process. But I think we also need theoretical deepening in certain instances. By theoretical deepening, I mean how to connect, I don't have an answer yet, I'm working on that, how to connect the real economic analysis framework with questions that addresses the political economy and even development. And I think this responds in a particular way, not perhaps in the same way that capitalism does, the book of capitalism does, to this importance and emphasis of the process of development, which is, I want to emphasize again, fundamental for the work of Anwar. And Anwar, you can correct me, but we can always discuss on that if that's important with you. I think we need concretization. We need to move from the abstract to the concrete by means of introducing further complexities. And we have to expand. By expand, I don't mean losing the economic thread, which is always fundamental for Anwar. The laws of capital accumulation, the laws of competition, the laws of capitalism. But also introduce further complexity, especially institutional realities, at some point of analysis. Contemporary developments in production chains and global finance. But production chains, we also saw today a presentation that could be part of this movement. We need to address also the power dynamic at some point of the analysis on a lower level of abstraction, forms of imperialism, but also include political and ideological sphere in the process of understanding and even development. And my research, should I talk about my research or should I just wrap it up? My research would actually try to draw certain threads, concretize the framework, especially by understanding European integration and Greek and even development, and moving even more concretely, probably explaining only the forward-looking aspect, this endogenous to capitalism process, about how Greek development is connected with European integration and competition within a union. It was a great pleasure, a lot of things on the table. I'm very happy to be here, and it's very great to celebrate the professor and being part of this great fest.
Our last student speaker will be Kurtson.
Alrighty, thank you everyone. Again, Danielle, Spencer, Clara, Mark, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, and of course to you, Anwar. So while everyone's talking about their motivations, I thought I would share a bit of a funny story of why I'm actually here today. 2 years ago, Anwar was teaching his final course, the course he was teaching for 5th years, political economy, except he didn't have a TA. And I was wondering, well, who are you getting the TA for? And then 2 months later, I get an email from Sylvina saying, I got your application, and Anwar selected you. Except the funny thing is, I never submitted an application. So a month later, I bump into Anwar, and Anwar goes, Kurt, I had to find your email, put in your N number, and apply for you. And I think I can share that now because you're retired, so there's no problem. But that semester really led to this research. And this paper is kind of my second chapter of my dissertation. And on the sheet, you see something about economic rents. I go deep into that, but for today, and to honor Anwar, I wanted to talk about real competition and how I frame my theory of economic rents within the theory of real competition and really focus on that aspect. And what I also want to thank Tasa and Giannis for doing is kind of doing the broader strokes of Anwar's work. Because I'm going to talk about a very concrete thing. I'm going to talk about one desalination plant in Western Phoenix and that proposal and how I'm not going to use market failures. We're not going to do any game theory. There's not going to be a self-enforcement contract or marginal pricing discussion. We are going to use Anwar's framework, real competition, to show you why this desalination plant is being built. All right, so what is this thing? So December 2022, Arizona, a Republican House and Senate were like, we're going to build a desalination plant in Western Phoenix, and we're going to pump it from Mexico and build a pipeline to send drinking water to people in Western Phoenix. And the estimation is 3 million people will get drinking water in Western Phoenix, right? So to give you a visualization, or sorry, before that, the public policy debate around this is very interesting. So water conservationists and water advocates are plainly saying this pipeline is a big dumb idea. But the finance committee and the finance authority is saying, well, true, it is a dumb idea, but it's likely going to happen. So the question is, and I think this is important for all social scientists, is, well, the simple answer is maybe people in Arizona are just dumb. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, so as Ollie was saying, I can make fun of Arizona, right? And my dissertation would be 2 pages long, which said people in Arizona are just dumb and they do dumb stuff, right? But that's not how it works, right? Especially when you understand the specifics. So these are real quotes, by the way, that are going on in Arizona at the moment. So here it is. And if you're wondering, Kurt, could you not get a better picture for us? This is the actual bill, and the Senate Bill 1740. This is the actual diagram released. So here's Mexico, Rocky Point, and they're gonna build a pipeline to Western Phoenix. So what I want you all to remember is that right here is a town called Buckeye, Arizona, right? The town, it's for the last 3 years, it's been the top 15 fastest growing cities in America. So, to understand this, we have to look at the overall water resources in the Colorado River Basin. So you have the upper basin and the lower basin. The first thing I want you to realize is how the natural watershed, or the natural water flows of where water goes, does not match the state borders, right? There's different, like, New Mexico gets water from here, but look where the watershed is, right? And also, just for fun fact, the 7 states negotiate over the water usage, and then Baja California and Sonora, 2 Mexican states, aren't included in these negotiations, and you have to go through the Secretary of State, Homeland Security. So that's essentially what's going on, right? And again, this is where I'm from, so that's why that's where this motivation comes from. Now, in neoclassical economics, we treat production, as Maskell famously said, a black box of production, right? And one thing I love about Anwar's framework is that's nonsense. No, let's go into the box of production, right? So naturally, if we ask, well, what is this black box of production? We're going to ask, well, where's the water going, right? So the main water source is the Colorado River, starts up here, exits down here. And if we look into that, and this is really astonishing, if you take all the water use of residents in Phoenix, San Diego, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Tucson, it is all less than alfalfa production. Alfalfa is a type of hay used to feed our livestock, right? So it uses, of all the Colorado River, alfalfa consumes 37% of it, right? And to really get to the why are we doing this? Why are we growing alfalfa in a place with no water? Utah, the state's domestic product, 0.2% comes from alfalfa production. That 0.2% uses 68% of the state's entire water supply. So the question is, again, I see everyone shaking their head like, why are we doing this? This does not make sense. It's a big, dumb idea. Well, ta-da! Theory of real competition. Okay, so the 2 main findings of the theory of real competition are what? One, within the industry, there's a uniform price. Don't worry, I know you're all dying to know, in alfalfa, the average or uniform price as of last year was $244 per ton, right? But what makes this story really interesting and how real competition can explain that big dumb idea is across industries as we get a turbulent equalization of profit rates, right? But the question that always I struggled with, and Anwar really helped me with, is what's driving this new investment? What makes a capitalist go, oh, I'm gonna put my money here and put it in this industry, or vice versa? And the answer to that question is a regulating capital, right? At any moment of time within any industry, there are a set of capitals representing the best generally reproducible condition of production. Now, this took me like 2 years to figure out what the best generally reproducible condition of production meant. I used to think it meant technology, and everyone was like, no. And then I was like, well, is it labor unit cost? And he's like, no. So I was struggling with it. Until I listened to a podcast, Odd Lots, of when they interviewed, and this isn't Harvard Business Review, but this is an alfalfa farmer, who said this: the dry down process, the curing process, is extremely important. In a lot of the country, farmers don't have the climate Arizona has, so they're fighting a lot more of the weather than Arizona farmers fight. So this concept of a curing process, or the drying down of your harvest, is what I would argue an example of the most general reproducible condition of production. And remember what I said, or remember Buckeye, Arizona? This is Buckeye, Arizona. Trevor Bales is an alfalfa farmer from Buckeye, Arizona, and that's where most of the production of alfalfa in Arizona comes from. But then again, as Giannis was saying, I could hear Sheikh's voice, what about the empirics? Can we actually go to an empirical, like, if this is true, right? If Arizona really does have the best general reproducible system, most generally reproducible condition of production, then we should be able to see it in yield per acre of alfalfa. So, look, 8.3. So the highest yield production of alfalfa is Arizona. And if you also look, the average is 3.1 for the entire country. And if you look, all the states I just mentioned, except Wyoming, are also higher than 3.1. So we're seeing this same phenomenon play out. And then, and also just FYI, it's too damp in the southeast to really compete with alfalfa production. And also Anwar, because I know you're wondering, this would be the marginal land where everyone else gets to get rent from. So, and then again, not Harvard Business Review, sorry Anwar, but from everyone's favorite KYMT, Yuma's leading Fox News representative, we found this. And Claire, I swear this wasn't just because you're Italian. The durum wheat that Barclay Seed Company grows in Yuma, Arizona is used specifically for the manufacturing of Italian pasta. So they send 150,000 tons per year from Yuma to Italy so they can make pasta. And the wheat grown in the Yuma area is a specific variety that has a higher gluten strength, which means it has a higher quality pasta. And this is in Yuma, Arizona. Oh, and also, one thing I forgot to mention is the alfalfa in, can I have more time I thought? The alfalfa in Arizona, the alfalfa in Arizona has such high quality that they ship it to Saudi Arabia to feed Saudi cattle, and also they export it to China as well to feed Chinese cattle. Because the reason the drier alfalfa is, it's easier for cows to digest, which leads to higher milk and higher dairy products, right? And then I just find it so fascinating that then when you go, it's not just the alfalfa story. You also have durum wheat, which is also a very water-heavy crop that also gives you this competitive advantage. And this is where I really like your input, Anwar, is, right, what's hard about when you understand turbulent equalization and there's no, like, equilibrium, is that, right, Italian pasta making has been going back since at least the 4th century. Arizona didn't become a state till 1911. So that means that, right, Italian pasta makers in the last few decades found out, like, oh, well, if we buy this wheat from Arizona, right, and that's what I want you to think about is the concept of how regulating capitals can change through real competition. So, wrapping up, we just see that the thirsty crop production in the region is decreases water security, or the amount of water available to manage. So you need alternative aspects of fresh water, and that leads to desalinating Mexico because Arizona doesn't have a sea. And how much time do I have? What's really interesting, and I'm very sorry to shamelessly plug my blog, but it is interesting, I swear. You all are, some of you may be aware that the Biden administration has passed the CHIPS Act, right? The CHIPS Act is to make little the chips that go in all computers and stuff like that. And they're building it in, Intel is spending $20 billion in Goodyear, Arizona, and then in Phoenix, a Taiwanese company is getting $5 billion in subsidies and $6 billion in loans. Now, would anyone like to know what is a very water-intensive production process? You guessed it, chip manufacturing. But the water you need is ultra-pure water, which is accomplished through desalination. So what they're doing is they're doubling down industrial policy for desalination. And that is what I will leave you with. And thank you so much for your time, because usually people are like, is he going to talk about water again? So thank you so much.
So I'd like to invite the student speakers and Anwar up here, and we actually have about 35 minutes for discussion.
I would also like to thank the organizing committee for not having any water bottles.
We do have plastic glasses.
It's okay, baby steps.
Maybe we should have, am I supposed to be here?
You're than me.
Do we have paper? Can you make glasses out of something you are weak, you are alpha? You use them the wrong way. Well, let me just say that these applications are exactly the kind of thing. Again, these applications are exactly the kind of thing that I hope to see from the framework I've been developing for a long time. Because initially the framework was focused on trying to understand deeper patterns. And the deeper patterns are there that you have to dig. And then it led to how this is different from other schools of thought, monopoly capital, because you have to establish what the point of this is. And then the question was, what implication does that have? And that's still a fairly abstract level. But as it developed over time, people began to use it more concretely to explain phenomena. And this is a set of applications here. You can see how it can be developed. Now, development is a process that people take over an idea and do it their way. And I don't necessarily understand that because I don't know that completely. I try to learn. But I'm happy that it becomes a way to understand the world, not just some particular thing, but some general patterns. And all the talks today were about general patterns. So, I keep forgetting, I used to be very nearsighted, so I could see things close but not far. Then I got cataract surgery and now I can see far but I can't see close. I still need glasses.
Anwar, speak more.
Oh, I did, yeah, sorry. One of the things that is important for me about being concrete is to move step by step. Because in each step you introduce something which is different. And if you don't fully explore the implication of that step, and you start piling on steps, then you can't distinguish what contributes to what. Someone mentioned before that my earlier training was as an engineer. The thing about engineering that is so cool is that you have to know physics, but you also have to know how to tighten bolt. Because an aircraft is not just theory. It has very concrete implications and applications. And something small can mess it up. And everybody remembers the Challenger, but you may not remember. And a spacecraft, that rocket that the US sent out, and it broke up and killed all the people. Why? Because they did not anticipate that the fuel used would spill over to the seals, and the seals would become so cold, they would crack, and then disaster. And they just didn't think of that. But unfortunately, that is how you learn. Sometimes you can't think of everything. And it changed the way you build rockets. But it is an example of how something small can make a big difference. And in engineering, I started as an nautical engineer. The first thing you learn is you design the airplane, but somebody else flies it. Because you don't know what's going to happen. And that's why you have pilots to risk their life to see if your thing works. Now these are my pilots. They're going to risk their lives. And that's good. That's good. The other point, again, is that if you want to build up to the concrete, as I said, step by step.
People in mine are getting upset because they can't hear you. So they're only trying to turn mics. Or you can have one in your hand.
Okay, that's good. It's easier.
Sorry, just because that's really frustrating.
If you're gonna be more concrete, please try to do it one step at a time. And it's not so simple because the steps are connected and all that.
but then you get a sense of what each is adding, and then when you combine them, you get a sense of their combination adding, and that's very tedious. It's not exciting. It's kind of boring, because you want to get to the conclusion, and there you are, taking one step at a time. But in my opinion, that's the only way you can do it. You really have to understand the influence of individual things. Let me give you an example. There's not a movie, by the way. I can't think of a movie for this. But one of the oldest ideas in human thought, and at least analysis, is that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. I mean, it's observational. You can prove it in a variety of, I mean, every culture knows this. Everybody has an explanation for it. But it took Newton to say, well, that's not actually true. Here's a vacuum, and I drop a feather and a steel ball, and they fall to the same rate. What does this establish? It establishes that there's another factor that causes a difference, which is not their weight. That factor is their resistance or their reaction in a fluid. So you take this vacuum and you put air in it, the steel ball falls faster, the feather falls slower. You put a denser fluid, neither falls. That is how theory should proceed, in my opinion, because then you attribute the movement to the specific factor under the influence of the general factor. And it is very time consuming, and it's tedious, and you don't know necessarily how it's going to turn out, by the way. But you have to subject yourself to this process, and it may invalidate what you think. Well, that's part of the thing, right? The science should invalidate something that you do. So when I see things, as they will tell you, I tend to say, wait, slow down, back up. And then my favorite phrase, back up. Because you're throwing too many things at once, and I can't grasp what's contributing to what. And that's how I work. I get an idea, and sometimes it's so exciting I fall off my chair. But then you have to go back and say, okay, how do you construct this? How do you test it? Is it right or wrong? Does it apply to everything? That's much more tedious. But when it comes together, as it has in these, it's something nice. It's something beautiful. So I commend these efforts. I'm not sure I understand all the complexities, because they have to be derived. I'm not familiar with some of them, but I'm not sure what's the fluid, so to speak, and what's the gravity, all of that. But that's how you try, and you may change your mind as you do it. That's good. Nothing wrong with that. So I'm gonna. There's one more point that I forgot what it is. Yeah, let me stop there. I have another point, but I don't remember what it is. We can take questions.
Jason Heck, I teach at Raymond College, actually teach finance. I was Anwar student 3 decades ago, actually before that. And I had taken Anwar's idea to heart about looking at business literature. It's probably the only dissertation on the planet Earth that tried to apply real competition to the automobile insurance industry. And the challenge, as I see it going forward for the next generation, is when you get into the business literature, you have to deal with a lot of technical parts. As Anwar said, that there are many, many levels. And it took the better part of almost 4 years to figure it all out. And one of the issues with looking at unit costs, if you're using financial records today, and this information I had was from a massive proprietary database just on the property casualty insurance industry. And the actual labor costs are embedded in categories like expenses. And this was very important for determining the capital labor issue. I don't want to go on and on about this, but this is, to me, is very crucial for future empirical work. And John Sarich, sitting here to my right, also an Anwar student, kind of finished around the same time. We looked at the steel industry by firm, and we looked at the retail industry, Walmart, this would be just general consumer retail. And so there were very pronounced hierarchies, and John handled the macro turbulent side, and we kind of got the result, I believe, John can correct me. But at the micro level, where I was going firm by firm, it's a challenge to identify empirically the regulating capital. And I'm really glad to see that Kurt is taking that very seriously, because it's a project that frankly is very, and I urge everyone who's going into this area to try to find a real clean data set where you can separate the labor costs. Because in general, FactSet and all the commercial data banks are not going to be helpful here, but there are proxies you can use. That's all.
Thank you. I think Sandra had a question, or Ronald.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So Kurt, I have a question for you. Yeah. Very interesting data, very interesting case. But I wondered if there's a missing political economy element in your argument. Because that 0.2% of GDP in Arizona is clearly translating into policy choices being made by the regulators, the legislators, and so on. So how do we explain that? And presumably that has something to do with the high level of profitability of the alfalfa farmers. So we shouldn't be looking at the 0.2%. There's some other number larger than 0.2, which represents the importance of the alfalfa farmers' profits in the profits being earned in Arizona, or in the particular sub-state economies in which they are important, which in turn influence how legislators vote or something like that. So could you please flesh that out? I think that would be important for making your argument fully persuasive.
Is this working? Okay, yeah, so the political economy aspect of it is one that there is no reason that the 7 states, so Utah, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Nevada, and Wyoming and Utah, Colorado, sorry. They are bound together by a 1922 agreement, but then within each state, the water managers and the local, the state governments handle the water management. So what's kind of the main reason I brought up the Utah statistic for Arizona is that desalination plant, the estimated cost is $5.5 billion. 0.2% of Utah's GDP in 2023 was around $5.5 billion. However, the latest round of water cuts do not impact the northern basin, which Utah is a part of. And Utah is also a very red state. And I'm not kidding you, but you could, John Oliver has, from last week tonight, has a brilliant clip of the governor of Utah. When they asked him, what are you going to do about water scarcity? He, with a straight face, says, I'm asking each and every one of you to pray for rain. And ask God that, and Joseph Smith to give you more rain this time. And I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. So there is no incentive for Utah, who, and what's really interesting, Utah actually has the lowest cost of water of any state in the United States, because they tie water costs into their property taxes and not actually through a market mechanism or how much water you use. So I would say the incentive, and this is actually where more like a game theory free rider problem comes in, is Arizona is facing the brunt of this water situation where Utah doesn't have any legal, why would you care about Arizona alfalfa farmers if you're Utah? That's the kind of, I would argue, the political economy lack of incentive. That even though as a state, I agree to this much of the Colorado River, I don't have to give a damn of, if I'm Utah, I don't have to give a damn about the profitability of alfalfa farmers there, but I do have to care about the alfalfa farmers in my state. So, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think it gives a more detailed explanation of the deeper political economy and politics incentives within the state of Utah versus Arizona in the competition over water.
Would it be right to say that some of the issue is not the economics of the profitability of these particular alfalfa farmers, but the fact that the rules were made a century ago that were currently operated on?
I'm sorry, I didn't question. Which rules? I missed that.
Well, that they're still using allocation decisions made a full century ago.
So historians of the Colorado River call it what's been referred to as a history of willful ignorance. So the original allotment of Colorado River water is 15 million acre-feet. That's a lot of water. Don't worry about the specific amount of water. But what's fascinating is, even at the time, hydrologists were telling all the policymakers, you don't have that much water to allocate, right? And this is before even Mexico got their share, or even American Indians were allowed to own water, get any water from the Colorado River. So even from the basis of the allocation of the Colorado River, it was already over-allotted. However, it is policies from over a century ago, but you see the same pattern of prioritizing economic stability and economic, the profitability of farmers over whether we have enough water in the region or not. So that's how I would, yes, but then we're continuing to do the same problems today, as you see with the, why would Taiwan build a chip factory in Phoenix, Arizona, if the main resource you need for processing chips and the chip manufacturing is the processing where you need water? Why would you go to a place with no water? Right, so and what I would argue when we talk about the fluidity of using the gravity metaphor, is that this all doesn't make sense unless you understand the relationships, the social relationships under capitalism. Then we can actually make sense of why do people why are economies growing so much and using so much water in areas that aren't that much water.
Let me just ask a question then. They're doing it, so they're doing it because it's highly profitable, right?
Yes.
So, in some sense, there's no contradiction, because the gain is the private profit, and of course the state gets caught up in supporting that gain, which is exactly what we want to see from the point of view of real competition. I'm just asking you to.
I'm saying real competition explains that phenomenon.
But it's a very profitable, highly profitable.
Yeah. Well, no, but we'll talk, because then we also have to finish the complete story, we need the economic rent aspect of it. So you get the relative, right? Because what was fascinating is that in the 1990s, a Saudi Arabian firm started a company called Tucahoma, Arizona. So if you ever start a company in another country, just call it by whatever country you're in. And it took 30 years for Arizona to figure out that this was a Saudi-owned firm, and they were transporting the alfalfa from Arizona to Saudi Arabia to feed their cattle. And that's how I would argue, well, quality versus profitability, but I would argue that the quality is tied up within the profitability of it. That's how I would answer your question. I don't know if I fully did though.
Yeah, I mean, the real question is why are they doing it? Could they get alfalfa somewhere else cheaper? And if not, then they're getting the best deal they can. I mean, maybe the state has something to do with that, it always does. But why did they come all the way across the world to
pick that. So that's an important economic.
Well, I think actually the conversation has drifted into what I was going to ask about. That is that it seemed to me that all three presentations are dealing with the geography of outcomes, whether it's water in Arizona or deindustrialization of Michigan or development in Greece. And I was just wondering if there was anything to be learned about the geography of those outcomes. And, well, I was thinking of what I was just going to call the geography of ownership. But it might actually be the geography of demand. Because I was thinking the only thing I perhaps do know is that I picked up a week or so ago that, you know, there's a crisis in the aquifer in Arizona because of essentially developments in the Saudi dairy industry that have been going on. But so I just wonder if this triggers anything in the minds of any or all three of the panelists. Is how does the geography of the outcomes that you're concerned with how is it affected all by the geography of, is it ownership in the case of the Saudis, or are they simply buying from local farmers in Arizona? I'm not sure. Geography, that is the question.
You two, I think I've been talking for most of the time. Do you two want to start?
So, for me, my particular research, I start off with the abstract, real competition in the abstract. Geography is, everyone can hear me, right? Is this Hello? Okay, all right. So, for me, geography, the focus on geography is an outcome of reduction in abstraction and getting close to the concrete. And it so happens that the geography is what we end up in our application, end up bringing out. For me, I can't speak for others, the application of a coherent framework is the point of departure. And I'm motivated by an alternative framework, i.e. real competition, because so many of the questions are not answered, as I mentioned in my remarks, in neoclassical treatment of, let's say, farm behavior. And also, the glaring obvious history of thought critique, it's based in fantasy, and they're not even talking to neoclassical economists, they're not even, going to contest that much. So, yeah, geography it's an outcome of attempting to concretize. There are other ways to come to the concrete. There probably are, but it so happens in our immediate, in our applications, geography has emerged in that way. I do plan to publish in geography journals. Anwar actually got afraid. I went to UMass Amherst and I gave a talk, and Anwar was like, "Are you trying to be a geographer or an economist?" Really the point here is concrete gives you, brings you to interesting aspects of phenomena, geography, culture being one of them.
I don't have to add a lot because it has already been discussed in terms of the abstract and the concrete, but I think in my case what I'm trying to say in my research, and it's not only a kind of empirical problem or kind of concrete problem, it's also a theoretical problem, right? That at some point of the analysis, institutional realities matter, and if we understand geography, in the Greek case, as being part of a political and economic union, then it has to play a role in this process of uneven development. And this is what I argue in a sense, that it's not something exceptional about Greek capitalism, although there are processes of capitalism that are particular, the way that capitalism developed in Greece, in terms of chronological type, but at the end of the day, it's the process endogenous to capitalism, right, that perhaps explain the contemporary form of Greek economic development. But one has to argue the geography, the institution. So in that sense, if I have to contribute somehow in the discussion, is that we have to consider not geographies, because capitalism is a global system, but institutional realities under which geographies are actually subsumed. If that makes sense, if that answers the question.
So, in a way, do you think it's fair to say that the political dimension comes with the concretization. Delving into the
Is it a question to me?
a general question here. So is the idea here that the political dimension becomes relevant once we concretize the theory of real competition and these more specific dimensions?
Can I answer? I have a small thought on that. Personally, I am influenced in my work from Althusser and the questions of causality, and questioning the questions of causality. But I think I always insist, and I think it's a contribution of Anwar's, that one has not, shouldn't lose focus of the economics, of the economic threat, because apparently when you start from the political, you lose the economic, or you approach the economic to the political. But if you start from the economic sphere, have a solid grounding on this process of endogenous to capitalism, capital accumulation, competition, profit-driven competition, etc., then I think by concretizing you can introduce this aspect. And it's not only politics, but also ideology. Ideology at some point plays a role. And just to give an example, productivity, skills, has to do at certain level of analysis with ideology as well, right? There is some feedback, I think, between this process. It's not just the economic determining everything, but one has to start from the economic to understand these connections and the kind of principled position of the economic in the analysis. But as you would say, Clara, the economic is political, right?
And Mark, this is I'm gonna set you. Unfortunately, now you're on my water ownership in Arizona email thread list. Yeah, so that was your fault. Because there was actually a really interesting story about how a town called Queen Creek in Arizona, all their residents one day found out that the city council sold all their water rights to an investment firm. Just one day they were like, wait, why'd you do that? And, yeah. But the kind of more important, and this goes directly to Clara's question, is one aspect I've really enjoyed of my dissertation research is exploring American Indian culture. And unfortunately, it is a very long history of not being allowed displacement and then also lack of ownership. So for what I mean by lack of ownership is over last summer, the Supreme Court heard the plea of the Navajo Nation and they asked them, can you guarantee water rights to us so that we can actually own water? And the Supreme Court said, well, based off of the 1868 Navajo American Treaty, you do not get to own water rights. You're not promised those. So it's not only a question of kind of the politics of access to water, but then I would also the access of whether you're even allowed to own water. And then on top of that, there's another Supreme Court case last year, EPA versus Sackett, that determines whether wetlands. And what's really interesting is we actually found Justice Alito even claims that we don't even have a legal definition of water in the United States, right? Because the Clean Water Act just says water a bunch. It doesn't say like, is this a part of the Clean Water Act versus a puddle in the ground versus a lake, and what's covered under that? So there are these legal definitions that even before we can consider something like I don't want to say the demand for water, because it's a human right, but before those considerations, it's also, well, if you demand something, then you demand from whom, and whether that whom is allowed to physically own that source or resource. Yeah.
Let me make a comment. I think Mark. I didn't know when you say that. It's not a bad comment about geography. Demand is very important. Demand has to, at the micro level, demand has to find supply at a cost, right? So we're talking about Saudis coming to the U.S. to a particular location to buy water. They're not stupid. They're very, very smart in this kind of thing. I lived in Kuwait for a while. They pay attention to the detail, even though they're rich. And what is the attractive difference. And this is something that Irvin Fisher writes about with arbitrage. He says the difference between price of corn in one area and price of corn in the other is not zero, but it's a cost of transportation, taxes, and tariffs. So that if it doesn't pay to go over that, then it's not going to be done. My parents lived in Canada most of their life, and I was into computers, and my computers were much cheaper than theirs in Canada. And I looked at it, I went through all the numbers. Well, Canada implies a 10% tax if you come in, and their tariffs were specific things. And so it turned out, when you look at that, the cost of basically the same. I said, okay, I'll bring you one, but Canada doesn't allow you to do that, because you have to pay the tariff. So that was equal prices in a concrete condition. And in this case, I don't know what the answer is, but I would definitely like to know, why do they do this? Why don't they go somewhere else? And my guess is, my instinct is that because this is something they can find better here than they could elsewhere. By the way, desalinization is, water shortages are going to go. I mean, there's a lot of, I follow these technical things, but there are a lot of devices now that even for a small village can take seawater and desalinize it and make it available to the village. They're in the stage now that they're being built and tested. My brother's a development economist, so this is a great concern to him. That's going to change the whole location of water supply. It's going to change the demand. And what's the important thing here? Cost. Because now small villages be able to afford it, and arid countries be able to afford it. And Saudi Arabia is not going to be coming to your state anymore.
As you can guess, I like many things Anwar say, and many phrases, and one of them is competition is not ballet, warlike. He uses also this book, and the other one is order arising out of disorder. So thinking these two phrases and relating to real competition. I mean, so far what we heard about real competition is competition among capitals. And their unit of analysis, individual firm. But real competition doesn't take place in reality in an orderly, logical fashion. What I argue, I wonder what you think about these things, I think that there is another set of real competition among laborers. I think which has a lot of relevance and what kind of choices firms can make under real competition. And so, would you reflect on that? I mean, real competition, whether exclusively capital to capital, and we should start with that and then add, so to speak, competition among laborers, or if we apply the notion of real competition, labor to labor competition, conflict or competition, whatever we call, would you expect any ramifications of your analysis, especially yours, in terms of job losses?
Yeah, worker-to-worker competition. So the third chapter of my dissertation deals with that, and in my, talking about the economic geography of Southeast Michigan, at the level of concretion, it's racialized workers paired against white workers, and there's a whole process with which I'm developing it. This kind of worker-to-worker competition that is, that along the lines of race plays out, and it has to do with segmentation, which is, I'm tying it with, in order to protect against de-skilling and the tendency towards like homogenization in terms of skills in the workforce, to protect against that, labor unions were fighting for seniority rights, rules to protect certain workers, to have a little bit more control over their own work lives. It turned out in Detroit, these workers were disproportionately white men. And it had this effect of segmentation along the lines of race. And in the attempt to lessen that perceived competition, white workers would contain racialized workers, both geographically and also occupationally. So yeah, it's immediately. So it's not there's no sequential order, like capital to capital competition comes first, and then labor to capital, and then worker to worker. I try to tell the whole picture simultaneously. I mean, you could do it. It depends on how you're framing the question and what your object of investigation is, right? It's real. So yeah, that's how I would deal with worker to worker.
If I can add something to that concern, I mean, there is a Latin phrase in Anwar's book that says, "Bellum omnium contra omnes," everyone against everyone. And in that competition, it's not only capitals against capitals, it's capital against labor, labor against labor, and there's a third component, that's state, right? And that somehow needs to enter the discussion. And I would like, to ask if the panelists can also ask the other panelists, especially Anwar, what's the role of state in the framework, and whether it's actually can, in a sense, impact, even in a turbulent sense, the patterns that we see, or its agency is completely out of the question, it's override. So state intervention cannot override the patterns of capitalism in the turbulent and macro sense. I mean, that's a question that I'm struggling in my head. And if it matters, at what level it matters.
Okay, now we're getting into the real stuff.
With 2 minutes left.
The important thing about competition, and the point that Hayek makes, is that it is a set of attempts, most of which fail. And you have to understand that success and failure are not guaranteed. Just because you think you can do it doesn't mean you will. Something like 50% or more than 50% of firms fail to survive beyond 5 years in good times in the U.S. because there's no guarantee at all. And businesses understand this. And one of the things they do is they sometimes wait long enough for the tide to shift. And that's what I mean by the idea that competition is a war, because the other thing that's preventing you from succeeding is your competitors. It's their job to prevent you. And there are different ways. The movie There Will Be Blood that was mentioned is about that. It's precisely about that. And it's true. It's about the real processes. Laws have been put in place so you may not burn down your competitor's plant. Well, at least you may not get caught burning down, right? Because that's against the law. Well, why do they have the law? Because they used to do that. That's what they did. And so that's competition. And it can be modified. It can be in different parts of the world dampened, but the incentive is always there. And the place to apply it can change, but the need to apply it doesn't change. So then the question of labor. We haven't talked much about that because in the next session where I'm talking about the work, my more recent work, it's clear that labor moves. That's why we have barriers. Everywhere, labor would come into all the advanced countries in a second if we didn't have that prevention barrier, because arbitrage, which is a very fundamental principle in economics, would be low-wage labor coming to high-wage labor. But then the high-wage labor would become low-wage labor. And there are political issues involved in that, and that's exactly political dam created in response to the natural tendencies of capitalist competition and mobility of labor, not just. Orthodox economists abstract from that, but also do classical economists, because in the beginning they talk about a country as a homogeneous entity in the sense of laws, so that you can move. And in many senses, the United States is like that. within the United States. But of course, those barriers come as people come across the border. Two implications of that. It's not true that the supply of labor is fixed. Because whenever the supply of labor gets tight, they open the gates. World War II, they opened the gates to black people in the country. They opened the gates to women. When World War II is over, they close the gates again. And so it's a very flexible, it's what Marx calls a reserve on labor. Creation of a pool of people you can bring in when you need it and throw back out. And these are also state regulated policies, but they are powerfully influenced by the need for that. And so I'll give a little advertisement for the next thing. So if you look at the United States and you see this mobility of labor, and if you do IRS data, you can plot the distribution of income. That is to say, in the bottom 20%, you have so many people, bottom tranche of income, 0 to 20,000, you have so many, and go in a bigger tranche, you have more, but it tails off. So if you, tails off that way. So if you look at that, the physicists discovered something startling, to me, actually blew my mind. If you take workers' income, and now we can track which is workers' income, IRS has it, the distribution is the same in every year. Every year. Now, how can that be? If you can put them one on top of the other, their levels are higher. If you adjust for the level, the distribution is identical, and it's an exponential. Then you take the top 3%, Musk and friends, the distribution is a different one. It's a Pareto, was first discovered by Pareto in 1897, looking at the incomes of the rich, and it's the same every year. It changes with the stock market and all of that, which you can track. So the question to ask is, this is, by the way, what I mean by real economic analysis. What could possibly make the distribution of income in every year the same? And then we went and we looked at race, class, and gender. Well, we know that women are discriminated against. We know that black people are discriminated against. So, and we could see the distributions are one below the other. You know which is lower, and you can track that, so the average difference. If you take out the average difference, the shape is identical. So what does that mean when we fight for equal incomes, equal rights? We actually move up people into a uniform and somehow God-given distribution. Well, that can't be true, right? So something has to be. So then I worked for a mere 10 years trying to figure this out, and we saw it. We saw the mechanism. I'm not going to tell you about it.
Thanks very much. I think right now we have a short break, and then we will reconvene at 4:30 for the final session of the day's conversation with Anwar.
Nick. Other Nick. If we're doing this again at some point, I have a bunch